But what I want to do today is I want to discuss the assassination with you in some detail, because I want you to be able to discuss this with your family and with your friends and neighbors throughout the rest of your life, really, to be able to talk about it in a very informed way. And the fact that President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963 is a very terrible event, and it was very sad for virtually everybody in the country. And as important as it was for the strategic impact that it had at that time on the potentials for completing a nuclear arms disagreement, for ending the Vietnam War much, much earlier than was the case historically, and the saving of millions lives that could have been saved if Kennedy had not been assassinated and was successful in bringing the war to an earlier end, and for the potential dismemberment of the Central Intelligence Agency at the end of the Cold War that should have logically happened. Despite as strategic as the assassination was in having an impact upon those events out of history, these are not really the most terrible aspects of the assassination. That the most terrible aspect of the assassination is once you understand who did it and who all was involved in covering it up, then it'll be very, very clear that the most dangerous aspect of this, and the most horrible aspect of it, is that it can happen again. Because the people who did it were not brought to justice. The people who were involved in covering it up were never revealed or brought to justice. And for that reason, the effectiveness of the assassination still remains with politicians today who realize what it is that can happen to them if they cross these particular people. So unless and until we, that is your generation and my generation, the millennialists and the baby boomers, join together to effectively reveal what it is that really happened surrounding this assassination, and take the steps necessary to deconstruct the structural sources that generated this particular assassination, it not only can, but it almost certainly will happen again. So that we want to address this issue directly here in the class. As you know, this isn't what the class is all about. What the class is all about is elucidating the kind of elite core of virtually all men who basically from behind the scenes manipulate United States domestic and foreign policy. And as we'll touch upon in the final couple lectures, we'll see that this has been happening virtually ever since the beginning of the country. But there was this especially tragic period when this occurred that we've covered in the class up to date. This whole period from the end of the American Civil War all the way up into including World War I and World War II and its aftermath that led to the assassination of President Kennedy. We're going to deal with a lot of the post-assassination history in the last few classes that we have together, but what I wanted to focus on here today is discussing the sort of the particulars, because so what I want to do is I want to go through basically I guess 5, 6 different steps here between today and Thursday with you. The first thing that I want to do here today is I want to set forth for you some of a dozen of the critical findings of fact and pieces of evidence that are pointed to by the Warren Commission and by people like Vincent Bugliosi, who wrote this big tome that's called, what do you call this thing? Recovering History? What is it? Reclaiming History, he called it. It's this big, like, 800-page book. And Gerald Posner, another fellow who wrote another book. These are two of the kind of definitive works that have been written trying to debunk the conspiracy theories. In effect, defending and trying to bolster the findings of the Warren Commission. And these are the findings, in addition to the Warren Commission, that have been embraced by virtually all three of the major television networks, ABC and CBS and NBC, and their principal anchor people, from Dan Rather to Peter Jennings and to others, and all of the major newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, etc. That these are the major news outlets for people, and CNN has now joined in this kind of dance that they do. They did at the 50th anniversary of basically setting forth this same thesis of Lee Harvey Oswald being the lone deranged gunman that killed the president. And that this is what I want to do first, therefore, is to lay out what some dozen or so key pieces of evidence are that they keep citing to. Then secondly, what I want to do is I want to set forth what I think are the now virtually uncontested pieces of evidence that show that virtually every one of those major dozen premises are fatally flawed. And then thirdly, I want to set forth what are pieces of previously concealed information that were actively concealed by the FBI, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Department, the National Security Apparatus, that intentionally concealed these pieces of evidence during the investigation. And then what I want to do is I want to set forth the key factual evidence that explains what most persuasively ought to be the conclusions as to what it is that actually happened surrounding the assassination, and very importantly, who greenlighted this assassination and who covered up the assassination. So those are the four major, or the six major steps I want to go through in presenting this, but I want to then afterwards put it into the larger context of the overall course that we're engaged in right now, because I said this isn't a course just about the assassination, but the assassination is one of the more dramatic moments in demonstrating the potential dangers of this particular cabal in our country. And then I want to go on to discuss why it's so important that we understand it. Yes, Sophia?
So I wanted to start with a question that both my dad has raised and that I've heard skeptics raise a million bazillion times. And see, I know that you know the real story, because I know you talk to the people who are involved, but how would you answer people, just to start out, how would you answer people who say the fact that nobody has come out and spilled the beans to the public in 50 years is evidence that there was nothing going on? Because apparently some scientists did a study and figured out that most genuine conspiracies come out within a certain amount of time. It's usually something more like 10, 20, 30 years, not 50.
Okay, well, there's a couple obvious answers to that. Number one is that the only conspiracies that they know about that have actually come out are those that have come out. And that those that have been successfully perpetrated and have still remained concealed, no one knows about. And so that's kind of almost dispositive of that particular argument. And secondly, There are conspiracies that have come out only because someone has fought all the way through the cover-ups and the concealments, and someone has been ultimately successful in digging through them and getting them exposed. And I know that I have and my staff have been those people, actually in a number of instances. And so I know personally that if we hadn't done it, that those conspiracies would remain today unknown. So I know dramatically that in fact there are conspiracies that have occurred that have in fact never been revealed. And so that it's directly contrary to any kind of assumption that, well, all the conspiracies that actually have ever happened have all been publicly revealed. Okay? And so that what I'll do is in laying out the pieces of evidence here, a lot of times you'll see that there are in fact significant numbers of people who now know that this was in fact a conspiracy. Not the least of which was the House Select Committee on Assassinations, that actually came to that determination and made an official request of the Justice Department to investigate it, and the Justice Department refused to do it. Okay, so the major third part of the answer to your father's position, Sophia, is that there are major powerful influences arrayed to close off any type of major public dissemination of a lot of this information. And those sources where you can disseminate a lot of it are ones that a lot of people don't know about, that there's been no public endorsement, no official government recognition of it. It's a lot like people saying, well, if in fact there was such a thing as UFOs, why wouldn't the government have said something about this? You know, but in fact you can find police officers and the chief investigator of the Federal Aviation Agency, you know, full-scale 3-star generals in the United States Army that have gone to great lengths to try to reveal the information about this and have been fired and disciplined over it. You know, and yet the people who don't know about that, who don't pay enough attention to the subject to know that these things has happened, they can go merrily along and make these kind of assertions. No reflections on your father. But the fact is that they conflate their level of ignorance with reality. And so that what we want to do here is I want to, as a first step, I want to point out a dozen or so of the key factual assertions about the assassination and what the flaws in those pieces of evidence are. And what I'm going to do at the end, depending upon the time that we have, I'm going to play for you the final lecture that I gave in the 20-lecture course on the alternative theories of the assassination of President Kennedy. This one has been not made available publicly. Just the people that were in the class know about this because pardon?
And why isn't it available publicly? Sorry.
Okay. Because the editor of the book that I'm writing and the HBO television program that they're probably going to do about it don't want this disseminated throughout the entire public. But it's going to be disseminated throughout the public later in this HBO series, a television series, probably. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is let's go through chronologically some of these major pieces of evidence that they keep putting up in front. That number one is that you need to remember that Lee Harvey Oswald was not arrested for killing President Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for allegedly killing Dallas Police Department officer J.D. Tippit. And that arrest was followed by the, quote, eyewitness testimony of a Miss Helen Markham, who the Warren Commission sets forth and all of the major news media set forth as the person who definitively identified Lee Harvey Oswald as the man having killed J.D. Tippit, therefore justifying, theoretically, his arrest for killing Officer Tippit, which allegedly led to the additional evidence against him.
Now, who the heck was Officer Tippit?
No, please don't, okay?
Sorry.
That's what I'm doing. That's what we're here for, is to talk about that, okay? So the bottom line is that this is the piece of evidence. The first one is that, well, he killed Officer J.D. Tippit, so he's a murderer. So that's established, and that's been established by an eyewitness account of him having committed the murder. So we know we've got a murderer on our hands here. And as it turns out, very conveniently, Lee Harvey Oswald dropped his wallet at the scene of killing J.D. Tippit. Just happened to have left his wallet there with all of his identification in it. And he also, allegedly, after killing J.D. Tippit in front of several people, only one of whom has allegedly identified him as being the person who did it, that he allegedly turned around and opened up the cylinder on his .38 revolver and dumped all of the shells, the spent shells, right on the ground. And that those shells that were ejected onto the ground matched the bullets and shells that were found in his gun when he was arrested at the Texas theater within an hour after the shooting of J.D. Tippit. And then, of course, the fifth fact they keep pointing out is that the Mannlicher Carcano rifle that was used to kill the president was found hidden in amongst the cardboard boxes at the Texas School Book Depository within an hour after the killing of the president. And this Mannlicher Carcano had been ordered through the mail by a person using the identification of A. Hidell, and that in the wallet that was found at the murder scene of police officer J.D. Tippit, there was a false ID in the wallet in addition to Lee Harvey Oswald's driver's license, driver's license. There was also a photo ID of him as A. Hidell. And that, there was also a palm print of Lee Harvey Oswald found on the Mannlicher Carcano rifle. And paraffin tests performed on Lee Harvey Oswald after he was arrested in the Texas theater showed that he had fired a weapon recently. And in addition, there's an extremely important piece of evidence that, that there was a neutron activation analysis performed on the fragments of the bullets that were fired into the limousine that were found scattered in the seats of the limousine and taken from the brain of President Kennedy and taken from the wrist of Governor Connally, that all match the magic bullet that was found lying on the stretcher of Governor Connally at the Parkland Hospital, that had passed through President Kennedy, striking him in the back and coming out his throat and hitting Governor Connally in the back and coming out of his chest and then hitting him in the wrist and then lodging in his leg. And that the tests that were performed, these neutron activated analysis tests by Dr. Vincent Gwynn established that these were all from the same bullet. And it was proven that that bullet was fired from the Mannlicher Carcano rifle that had Lee Harvey Oswald's palm print on it and had been ordered by A. Hidell, which the identification for which they found in his wallet. And that as I said, the shell casings, the three rifle, Mannlicher Carcano shell casings that were found lying by the window of the 6th floor in the Texas School Depository were all shown by the strike mark on the firing pin from the Mannlicher Carcano rifle onto the back of the bullet found on those casings. All were shown to have been fired by the Mannlicher Carcano rifle. And finally, that there was a palm print of Lee Harvey Oswald found on the boxes in the sniper's nest out of the 6th floor window of the school book depository. Now, after an opening statement like that by the prosecutor, you're sitting in the jury and you're going, well, I guess this is going to be easy. This guy obviously did the killing of the president, okay? But you start going down through these, and one of the major challenges is that there has never been any effective trial about this, so that all that you're getting is the information set forth by the prosecutor. The Warren Commission, is a prosecutorial document. And the fact is that you can tell by reading, if you read through the actual volumes of the Warren Report, which had to be compiled right within 1 year because they wanted to get the report out by the November 22nd anniversary of the killing, which would have made it November 22nd of 1964. That if you read through the documents, you will see that all of the interviews that were being conducted by the FBI agents, etc., were clearly engaged in an adversarial process, even against the witnesses, trying to compel the witnesses to say very specific things that they wanted them to say. Secondly, this Helen Louise Markham, who is the sole witness out of the 6 different people who saw the person who shot Officer Tippit, she is the only one who identified, allegedly, Lee Harvey Oswald. But when you, in fact, read her interviews, specifically an interview conducted by Mark Lane, an attorney from New York, that interviewed her about this, she states that the person who shot Officer Tippit was short, heavy set, and had long, bushy, dark, curly hair. Okay? And the fact is that when she was brought in to identify Lee Harvey Oswald, she never identified Lee Harvey Oswald as the person who killed Officer Tippit. She was asked by the officer in charge of the lineup, is there anyone in the lineup that looks familiar to you? And it turns out that she had already seen the photographs of Lee Harvey Oswald that were on the television after his having been arrested and brought to the police station. That's confirmed that she'd already seen his photograph. And she was only asked, is there anyone in the lineup that you recognize? And she said, well, when I look at the person who's in position number 2, all I know is that I get a cold chill when I look at him. And that's all she said. Okay, and so that they said, okay, that's it. She has positively identified him, and now that case is closed. He is the killer. Okay, so that number 3, the issue of the wallet being found right at the scene of the death of J.D. Tippit. It turns out that this particular wallet was allegedly found by a Sergeant Kenneth Croy at the scene and then turned over to Captain R. Westbrook. And there's a photograph, actually a local television station filming at the scene of the Tippit death, where you can see Sergeant Croy handing the wallet to Captain Westbrook. And so that they assert that therefore this is found at the scene, and it attaches him directly to the scene of the killing. The problem with that is that when you, and that's set forth in the Warren Commission. However, when you actually look at the records of the police department, it turns out that the wallet of Lee Harvey Oswald was removed from his left rear pocket by an officer, Paul Bentley, after Oswald was arrested in the Texas movie theater, and he was in the back seat of the patrol car. And that he has testified to that, and in fact, another officer, Gerald Hill, who was with him in the squad car, testifies to that effect, that that's where they got his wallet from him. Okay, and now you go to the scene of the death, and you find these 4 ejected shell casings. And what it said in the Warren Commission report is it said these shell casings that were found were in fact a combination of Remington 38 cartridges in Winchester Western shell casings. And when Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested in the Texas movie theater, when he was seized and they took his revolver from him, he had in the revolver bullets that were a mixture or a combination of Remington 38 bullets and Winchester Westerns in his pistol. And so they said, now there's another incriminating piece of information. What they don't tell you is that at the scene of J.D. Tippett's killing, that of the 4 spent shell casings that were found, 2 of them were Winchester Westerns, 2 of them were Remington 38s. And dug out of the body of J.D. Tippett were 3 Winchester Western slugs and 1 Remington slug, 38. And nobody talks about that. It's just that somehow this fellow gets 4 slugs in him, 3 of which are Winchester Westerns, and 1 of them is a Remington. And on the ground are found 4 spent shell casings, 2 Winchesters and 2 Remingtons. And there's also a fact that is left undisclosed, and that is that this identification, this photo ID of Oswald, allegedly found in his wallet in the name of A. Hiddell, they leave out the fact that in the first week of November of 1963, some 20 days prior to the assassination, a fellow by the name of Richard Nagel was arrested down in El Paso, Texas, after having come into a bank and walked into the bank and fired his pistol into the ceiling of the bank, and then sat down in his car waiting for the police to come. And they came and they arrested him for attempted bank robbery, and he said, "You ought to look in my trunk of my car." And they looked in the trunk of his car, and they found identification under the name of A. Hiddell for Richard Nagel, with photo ID of Lee Harvey Oswald in the name of A. Hiddell. Both of them. And it turns out that this Richard Nagel was a member of the Field Operations Intelligence, an investigatory group that was founded in Dallas, Texas by Charles Willoughby and H.L. Hunt and William D. Pauley back in 1952. 1 year after they founded the organization called Foreign Intelligence Digest. And it turns out that that They also left out the fact that when Lee Harvey Oswald returned from Russia, having spent some 18 months in Russia, he was met at the port in Hoboken, New Jersey, by a man by the name of Spaz Raikin, S-P-A-S, last name R-A-I-K-I-N, on June 13th, 1962. And Spaz Raikin worked as the deputy to the head of the Eastern European Anti-Bolshevik League, a man by the name of Stetsko. Yes, it's not Stanislav, but anyway, Stetsko, his name was. He was the head of the Eastern European Anti-Bolshevik League, an extreme right-wing element. And this person was a full-time correspondent for the Foreign Intelligence Digest that was actually established by William Pauley and H.L. Hunt and Charles Willoughby in Dallas, Texas. And also, they forget to tell you about the palm print that was allegedly found on the Mannlicher Carcano rifle, that the FBI lab had filed an official report stating that they had examined the entire rifle and there were no prints of any kind on the rifle. And it was an officer in the Dallas Police Department who said that he found the prints of the palm print on the rifle after the FBI had already definitively determined that there were no palm prints on it. And there is a record of this particular officer and his partner having gone to the room where Lee Harvey Oswald's body was being kept after he was assassinated 2 days later by Jack Ruby, and going into the room where his body was and locking the door, and had carried with them some long package. And that is also not talked about. But extremely importantly, they didn't tell you about the fact that Governor John Connally, sitting in the front seat or in the middle seat, the jump seat of the limousine with President Kennedy, in fact, is absolutely emphatic that he was not hit by the same bullet that hit President Kennedy, because Connally asserts emphatically that he heard the shot that hit the president, and he turned around to his right trying to see the president. He could hear him struggling in the back seat and started to turn around the other way, and as he got halfway back around, he was shot. But President Kennedy had already been sitting in the back seat holding onto his throat before Connally was ever shot. And in fact, there's a photo in the Zapruder film that two of the frames actually show this event taking place, of the president reaching and grabbing his throat. And at the time, John Connally is sitting, waving, holding his white Stetson cowboy hat in his right hand, looking and trying to turn around to the right to look to see what's happening to the president. And so that either the bullet was going so slowly that it went through the president and hadn't quite gotten to Connally yet. By the time he turned all the way around to look and then turned halfway all the way back around and it hit him, when you can see him being hit by the bullet that hit him and the white Stetson going flying, because his right wrist was shattered by the bullet that hit him. And they also failed to tell you that Dr. Gwynn, the man who is alleged to have performed the neutron activation analysis on these particles found in the front seat, asserts that emphatically he was never given any of the particles of metal that were found in the front seat. or anywhere else in the limousine, despite the fact that he is cited as the person who performed these tests. And all of the doctors that were at the Parkland Hospital swear that, based upon their medical expertise, that they knew that the wound in the front of the throat of President Kennedy was in fact an entrance wound, and not an exit wound. Moreover, the assertion of the Warren Commission trying to get all the 3 shots that they say were fired, they say all 3 shots were fired by Oswald from the 6th floor depository building, all within 6.5 seconds. And it turns out that no one was able to duplicate that. No one was even able to fire 3 shots from the rifle within 6.5 seconds. The closest that they got were 8 seconds, and they were absolute armament experts, and they had the rifle bolted down, and that they fired it and moved the bolt action, and fired it and moved the bolt action, and wasn't aimed at or hit anything. And yet what they're asserting is that Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots in 6.5 seconds, hitting the president with 2 of them, and that 1 of them went through him and hit Connally, and that's how they explain it. Now, and moreover, the paraffin tests that were run on Lee Harvey Oswald that are cited by the Warren Commission proved dispositively that he had never fired a rifle, because the paraffin tests that were on his face, which he would have, if he had fired the rifle, would have left gunpowder residue on his face. And there were 4 other people that fired that Mannlicher in tests, and all 4 of them had gunpowder residue on their face. And so that there are a panoply of information and facts that have not been revealed in the Warren Report, and are consistently ignored by the major television networks and by all of the major news media. Not the least of which is, now that we know about, that there is a photograph that was taken in Dealey Plaza 1.2 seconds before the first shot hits the president. And it is a photograph of William Rip Robertson standing on the curb, on the northern curb of Elm Street, tipping his hat to President Kennedy. And you can see the limousine in the foreground of the picture, and Robertson tipping his hat to the president. Standing next to him is Grayson Lynch, a man who is the person who often worked with Rip Robertson in missions that he went on. And Rip Robertson is the man who was standing immediately next to William D. Pauley on the night of June 19th of 1963, some 5 months earlier, in the presence of Dick Billings, telling John Martino, "Don't worry, John, we're going to kill the motherfucker." And that's Rip Robertson, who was standing next to him, standing on the curb immediately next to the limousine, tipping his hat to the president 1.2 seconds before the first shot rings out and hits the president. There's also a photograph in Dealey Plaza of Edward G. Lansdale, who is walking past these hobos that have been taken out of a boxcar behind the grassy knoll, that they've been taken into custody, and they're being marched off, and he is walking past them, giving these hand signals to them. and the photograph of Edward Lansdale has been identified by his wife as being him, definitively. And he's been identified by Fletcher Prouty, who was the head of the he was the liaison between the CIA Covert Operations Directorate and the Joint Special Operations Agency of the United States Pentagon, providing military support to paramilitary operations by the CIA, when Ed Lansdale was actually working in the Central Intelligence Agency. And you'll remember, Ed Lansdale is the fellow who found the 12 troves of gold and platinum and silver and jewels in the Philippines that were placed in the Anderson Trust. And so you ask yourself, what is William Rip Robertson doing in Dealey Plaza? And why is Ed Lansdale there? And this is one plaza that is on a several mile caravan of the president driving from the airport all the way through Dallas on his way to deliver a speech at lunch, and of the hundreds of different locations along the parade route, there's one particular spot where Rip Robertson and Grayson Lynch are standing on the street corner, and Ed Lansdale is there in the same plaza. Okay? Now they also fail to reveal any of the information, and it's still concealed to this day. There's still this major position taken by the Warren Commission and by all of the major news media, asserting that Lee Harvey Oswald was a leftist, Leninist, communist who had defected to Russia, and he was disgruntled and unhappy and a deranged individual. And they leave out the entire history of Lee Harvey Oswald when he was in the Marine Corps, having been recruited to become a low-level intelligence gathering operative over at the Queen Bee bar next to the U-2 base in Japan, where he was based. And his commander tells that Oswald came back and told him that Oswald was being questioned by the women there, the bar women, asking him questions about the base. And his commanding officer states that he, in fact, introduced Oswald to a civilian from a civilian intelligence agency, who then began to give money to Oswald to have him go to the Queen Bee and to give false information to these women so that they could track it to see where that false information was going. And it turns out that that man's name was Richard Nagel from the Field Operations Intelligence. So that, and of course, I told you about the issue of Operation Tilt with Richard Billings standing on the deck next to William D. Pauley and Rip Robertson and John Martino, when Pauley told John Martino that they were going to kill the president. Okay, and that I also told you about the fact that Dick Billings came up from below decks the following morning and saw the USS Rex, a CIA warship that was based in Guantanamo, actually refueling the Flying Tiger. And William Pauley got very distressed over the fact that Dick Billings had seen this. And I told you before, the Rex has been identified as the CIA ship that brought a crew of Cuban exiles into Cuba in the first week of November of 1963, just at the beginning of the month where the president was killed. The Rex is the ship that brought the Cuban exiles to the island of Cuba and offloaded them. And it was, at the time, leased to Collins Radio Corporation. And that Collins Radio Corporation is a place to which George de Mohrenschildt had taken Lee Harvey Oswald to get him a potential job with Collins Radio earlier. So that there's myriad evidence that is directly encircling the assassination itself, which is over and above the more general information that we shared with you in this major graphic that we've constructed here of the different types of predominantly private organizations that made up a secret, primarily private, covert operations fascist alliance that was operational in the United States at the time of the assassination, and that these are the people who had JFK basically surrounded at this particular time. And so we have the graphic that I mentioned to you that we're working on now that we'll get to you on Thursday, which has at the core of it Allen Dulles and the additional players that were directly involved in the assassination itself. So that this constitutes a core that sort of resides at the middle of this larger graphic that sets forth the kind of political, the fascist political milieu in which Kennedy found himself in 1963 as he attempted to deconstruct the nuclear warheads of the United States military and the Soviet military, and to establish a normalized set of relations with Cuba and Fidel Castro. And so that these are the just some of the major facts that have not, in fact, been revealed to you. And the fact is that I have been able to find these facts. Now, it is true that I had at my disposal, 6 professional investigators, former military criminal investigators, working to dig out this information. But would you stop to compare that to how many investigators the FBI had, and that the CIA had, and that the United States Congress had, you can see that any good faith effort and that the Warren Commission had, that any good faith effort could have revealed all of this information. And yet, the information was not sought, and if sought and obtained, was concealed from the American people. So what I want to do is, we'll start discussing Thursday what the implications of all of this are. But what I want to do is I want to be able to play for you this is the final lecture. This is the final lecture of the 20 lecture series of the alternative theories of the Kennedy assassination, that in fact hasn't been seen yet by anybody except the folks that were in that class. Yes, Andrew.
I'm just curious. It might be a little bit off topic, but given all this information, that's pretty striking. It's surprising that there hasn't been a lot of public knowledge. But then there's other things like the MLK assassination, where the government admitted that they did it. The CIA said in a lawsuit that they did it and settled with the King family, and yet it's still unknown. Do you think that there's what's the mechanism of concealment that seems to keep things so?
Well, they didn't say they'd done it. The settlements always have a provision in them saying that we're not admitting anything. That whatever the settlement is, it's just too bothersome for us to have to deal with this. That's the line that they always take. And that there's always a provision in there saying that this is not acknowledging any kind of guilt or responsibility for the ultimate accusation that has been made, the gravamen of the complaint. But we're just settling this because it's too troublesome and burdensome to resist it. And that's all it takes. That you need to understand that the standard for these major corporate-owned media is plausible deniability. And not much emphasis on the plausible. All they have to have is some kind of rationale, like my dog ate my homework, my mother's horse died and I had to be at the funeral. That there are the kinds of cover-up, the standard for cover-up. In this particular instance, there were thousands and thousands of man-hours, and virtually all men, I think is safe to conclude, that was involved in constructing this cover-up. I mean, that the FBI agents, they were all given the assignment to go to work conclusively establishing that Lee Harvey Oswald did this all by himself as a deranged lone gunman. And half of them were lawyers. And one of the major problems with the legal profession, and you'll discover at law school that there are more, that they believe that when they have a particular client, that their job is to effectuate whatever the objectives of that client are. And so what they do is they conceal information which is exculpatory, and they marshal the evidence that is facially incriminating. And they do things like this. They say, well, that the shell casings that were found at the tip scene were a combination of Remington and Winchester expended shell casings, and the bullets found in Lee Harvey Oswald's gun were in fact a combination of Remington and Winchester shells. And the slugs that were taken from J.D. Tippett's body were a combination of Remington and Winchester. And that what you have to do as the lawyer on the other side is you have to say, exactly what combination was that? And if you don't know enough to ask that question, their judgment is that that's your fault, that they aren't really lying, that you just didn't catch them. And there's a big famous, you've all possibly heard about the Sacco and Vanzetti case. The Sacco-Vanzetti case was a big famous case back in the 1920s when there was this huge, quote, Red Scare going on right after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. And Attorney General Palmer had this big red squads that were going out arresting all kinds of different people. And there were these two guys, Sacco and Vanzetti, that were considered to be syndicalists, they called them, kind of socialist people that engaged in meetings with each other. And a armored vehicle of some sort was robbed. A payroll was robbed in Braintree, Massachusetts, and the people that were guarding the thing were killed, and they were killed with a .38 pistol. And they found that when they went and raided this house of Sacco and Vanzetti, they found one of them that had a .38 pistol. So they arrested them and charged them with the Braintree bank robbery, or the bank payroll robbery. And the evidence that they presented to the jury is that bullets fired from this gun were consistent with the bullets found in the body of the victims. And the defense attorney just sort of let that go on in, and the jury convicted them. But it turns out that the bullets were not fired from the same gun at all. It's just that they were both .38s. Okay, and so that's what they meant when they said it was bullets consistent with bullets fired from this other pistol. And so you have to understand that prosecutors assume that it is their job to get the person convicted. Once they make the decision that they're going to prosecute someone, that's what they do. And the problem is that on the other side, the criminal defense attorneys, and I was in the office of the #1 criminal defense firm in the entire world, and that was the office of F. Lee Bailey in Boston. The problem is they think their job is just to get their client off and to get paid as much as possible for doing that. And so they do the exact opposite. They get in and they conceal and confuse people, and all they're trying to do is get one person on the jury to refuse to convict them because they've got some reasonable doubt, and then they can get their person off. And so it's a terrible problem in the legal system. But when you don't have a trial and you don't have lawyers on the other side that are actually challenging these types of unilateral presentations that are being made, and that's what happened here in the Kennedy assassination, is that there was an instantaneous resolution on the part of all of the law enforcement people that they were going to shave and crimp and mold the evidence to make it appear that Lee Harvey Oswald killed the president acting completely by himself. And that's what you see. And the fact of the matter is that the culture has actually adjusted itself to this, whereby that if in fact a person is convicted, they just conduct themselves simply as though that person did it, period. And the fact is that most of the people, if the person is charged by the district attorney with doing it, they just conclude that it must be true. Because they'll say to themselves, why would the district attorney be charging somebody with this if they weren't the one that did it? Just these 2 days, this Tuesday and Thursday today, are the only time that we're going to be addressing directly the assassination of President Kennedy. And so I just wanted to get it all done in a couple of days. And so, but I didn't want to have to bore you with that watching the video. So I do want to direct your attention to 3 specific books if you want to get more detailed information about this. One of them is Jim Douglas's book. There's a couple readings that are in the reading list from him. Jim Douglas's book called JFK and the Unspeakable, which gives you lots of details. David Talbot's book, The Devil's Chessboard, is an excellent book. And Peter Dale Scott's book called Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. Okay, and what we'll do is I will for just this week, we'll put up the last 2 lectures in the JFK Alternative Theories of the Assassination course, so that you can see them if you'd like, but we're not going to post those on the general YouTube place where you can see the course, each lecture in the course that we've had, in case any of you are using that to kind of review any of your notes or anything. So what we want to do is I want to finish today going over some of the details of the actual assassination itself, because next week in week 9 I want to discuss the aftermath of the assassination that points more and more toward the general explanation of the assassination that you get in the 3 books that I just referenced and that we've been explicating here in the course. And we're going to be discussing things next week which have to do with the Watergate burglary, the return of the impeachment resolution by the House Judiciary Committee against Richard Nixon flowing out of the Watergate burglary, what the connection between the Watergate burglary was and the Kennedy assassination, and the installation of the Church Committee, the House Select Committee, or the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Abuse, chaired by Senator Frank Church, and followed by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and the Iran-Contra Select Committee, all of which had these major select committees appointed in Congress because of this kind of sequence of scandals that besieged the United States during that period of time, which all arose out of this issue that we're talking about in this course, and that there was this very aggressive effort on the part of the national security state bureaucracy and this cabal that I've been talking about to suppress any type of full-scale revelation about what it is that was going on behind the scenes in all of those scandals, because it's all basically the same thing. Then in week 10, what I want to do is I want to return to the historical origins of this cabal to try to make clear that it wasn't just this narrow period of time that we've been talking about that went from just before World War I down to the end of World War II and the assassination of President Kennedy, during which this cabal has been functioning, so that you won't. I don't want you to leave this course being depressed about the fact that there's some sort of cabal that is in charge of the United States now during your lifetime that hasn't been going on the whole time. And I'm not sure whether that's more depressing or less depressing, but I want to then be able to address what it is I think we can do about it. So what I want to do today is I want to point out kind of a dozen or so key facts that makes it clear that the Warren Commission findings about the Kennedy assassination are totally unreliable. And then secondly, I want to point out a half dozen key facts that I believe point directly toward the larger explanation of the assassination that we're talking about in this class. And then I want to discuss this entire issue of the Kennedy assassination in the context of the general themes that we're addressing in the course, that being that there is this element, this elite element behind the scenes in the United States that basically dictates the foreign policy and the domestic policy of the United States. Okay, so the first point that I want to make on this, rather than taking you through the entire 2 hours of those last lectures in kind of potentially smothering some of the key points in this kind of detailed chronology, though as I say, it'll be available for you so you can have the whole organic chronology of what was going on. But I want to point out, number one, when I reflect back upon everything that I know about this and have come to know over the years, one of the very first things that leaps to mind is that this. Do we have this little machine right here? We just see this. Is that it? Right here. I guess it's not very clear, but the bottom line is there's no way that this man right here and this other man right here, this is William Rip Robertson. And this is Grayson Lynch, his sidekick. And you can see the front of the Kennedy limousine just coming into view here. And these two men are standing directly next to the famous Stennis freeway sign, behind which the limousine went to block out for a moment the first shot that hit the president from the Zapruder film. The famous scene where when the president comes out from behind the Stennis freeway sign where he's holding his throat like this, that you may have seen 100 times. This is 1.2 seconds before that. And this is William Rip Robertson tipping his hat to the president coming by. And there's no possible way that William Rip Robertson could be just standing in Dealey Plaza at 12:30 p.m. on the 22nd of November and not have been directly involved in whatever assassination might take place there at that time and place, because that was his job. He was, in fact, the field commander of the S-Force that we've talked about, that was put together back in 1960 at the request of Richard Nixon to assassinate Fidel Castro and Raul Castro, Che Guevara, and the other 5 comandantes of the new revolutionary government in Cuba. So there's no way that Rip Robertson would just coincidentally happen to be there at that particular place in a full 10-mile long parade route coming from Love Field, going to the location where the president was supposed to be delivering his noontime luncheon speech. To have this particular guy, who is the same guy who was standing immediately next to William D. Pauley on the night of June 19th of 1963, just 5 months earlier, on the deck of the Flying Tiger, when William Pauley, standing immediately next to him, told John Martino that not to worry, that they were going to kill the president. We're going to kill President Kennedy, referring to him as the MF at that time. So the reason why it just couldn't be coincidental is because of the direct testimony that I have now of Dick Billings having stood there and heard him say it. And I've now recently gotten him tape recorded confirming the fact that this was said immediately in his presence, and how terrible he feels about that having happened, and he did not do whatever it was that was necessary to keep that event from happening. So this is the first number one piece of evidence here as to why this could not have happened without Rip Robertson having been directly involved in the assassination. Secondly, there's no way that this particular individual here, there's no way that particular individual, who is Edward Lansdale, could possibly have been in Dealey Plaza. At the same time that William Rip Robertson was there, this is approximately 5 minutes after the shooting itself. And there are these three hobos that have been taken out of a boxcar immediately behind the grassy knoll. And they've been taken out of the boxcar, and they're being paraded from the boxcar to the Dallas police station right here by, you see the policeman here. And the fact that this particular policeman here that you see in the front is shown to have in his ear, in his right ear, an electronic telephone communication system that none of the Dallas police had. And this is a close-up picture, an expanded picture of Lansdale right here. And these are the photographs that his wife positively identified as being Lansdale. And Fletcher Prouty, who worked with him in the Joint Special Operations Command, identified him. And they all said if you could only blow these pictures up enough to see whether or not he has on his left hand this major ring that he used to wear all the time, right here. And that he has a very well-known what they call drooping right shoulder from an injury that he had suffered. And you'll see that right here. You see well, you can't see it as clear, but his right shoulder sags off to one side. You can see it a little better here. This is he right here. You can always see that his right shoulder always hangs down lower than his left shoulder. And his wife talked about that, and Fletcher Prouty talked about that, and the others who identified him in that picture. And they positively identified him in the picture before they knew exactly where it came from. But there's no way that Edward Lansdale could have been just coincidentally at Dealey Plaza, the same place where Rip Robertson was at 12:35 p.m. on November 22nd of 1963, without him having been involved in what it was that was happening there. And you remember that Lansdale was the fellow who actually found the $1.2 trillion in gold and platinum and silver in jewels that was brought to talk with Douglas MacArthur back in 1945, and they set up the Anderson Trust. And that he was a major person involved in the Anderson Trust, and he was in charge of the covert operations against the Cuban government in the CIA. And so that, and thirdly, there's no way that Santos Trafficante, who is the man who had set up that S-Force of the 15 anti-Castro Miami-based Cuban exiles, there's no way that Santos Trafficante would have told our office through Andy Tooney, who's our chief investigator. There's no way that Santos Trafficante would have told us, F. Lee Bailey's office, as Santos Trafficante's attorneys, there's no way that he would have confidentially told us that it was in fact the S-Force that had assassinated President Kennedy. That he told us this in May of 1973, before anyone had made such an accusation. And he told us this confidentially in the context of trying to explain why 3 of his former gunmen from Havana were in the Watergate Hotel, in burglarizing the Watergate Hotel, because F. Lee Bailey had been retained to represent James McCord, the former CIA wiretapping specialist, who had been arrested with Martinez and Gonzalez and Bernard Barker, the 3 anti-Castro Cuban exiles who were all Trafficante gunmen from Havana before 1959. And so that when Bailey made the inquiry of Trafficante why these guys were in the Watergate Hotel, he told us in May of 1973 that this was because the S-Force had been the ones who assassinated President Kennedy, and that they were, that Nixon, when he was running for the re-election in 1972, had become terrified, was Trafficante's word, had become terrified when he discovered that, Larry O'Brien had been made the new head of the Democratic National Committee and was going to be therefore supervising the 1972 election against Richard Nixon. And Nixon knew immediately that O'Brien had been, for some 20 years prior to becoming the new head of the Democratic National Committee, the Washington lobbyist for Howard Hughes. And as you'll recall, I explained that Nixon had contacted Howard Hughes to get Hughes to set up the assassination team to kill Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and the others. So there's no way that Santos Trafficante would have told us that, you know, being the first one to take any initiative whatsoever to communicate and reveal the fact that he knew that these were the people that had killed the president. And the fact is that later on enabled me to realize, when we got this photograph of Rip Robertson, and I was told by Dick Billings that Billings had been there when Rip Robertson was coordinating the team that went in to Cuba back in June of 1963 to attempt to assassinate Fidel Castro. That made it clear that that was an assassination operation. Rip Robertson was there at the time commanding that unit, and Pauly made that statement that they were going to kill the president. So there's no way that Trafficante would have revealed all of that to us in May of 1973 if in fact it hadn't been true. So it was a complete admission against his own personal criminal interests involved potentially in one of the most heinous crimes of the entire century. There was absolutely no reason why he would have said that to us. Okay, number 4 is there's no possible way that Lee Harvey Oswald would have just happened to have been in the Texas School Book Depository, immediately overlooking the very spot where President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd of 1963, unless that had been arranged pursuant to some type of a plan, given his particular background. And in that particular background, it makes it absolutely clear that he is not and had never been a pro-Castro leftist, as he was portrayed to be. And you go over the details that were concealed about Lee Harvey Oswald, and it becomes obvious that nobody of his particular background would have simply coincidentally happened to be there, in effect, in Dealey Plaza at the time the president came by, because we know that he had been, number 1, a very low-level intelligence operative when he was in the United States Marine Corps back between September of 1957 and November of 1958, when he was based at Atsugi Air Base in Japan, where he in fact had become, as I mentioned to you before, this low-level intelligence gathering operative against this place called the Queen Bee, which was a bar near the base where the women who worked at the bar were soliciting information from the personnel at the U-2 base, trying to get information about what was going on at the base. And Oswald, as I mentioned to you, reported this to his immediate superior, and he was immediately put in touch with this private civilian from an intelligence organization that basically began to give him money to bring to the Queen Bee, to spread the money around, to engage contact with these women so he could in fact give them false intelligence information, which could then be traced through the intelligence system to find out where it was going. So that we know that that's where he started in that operation, and we know that he was recruited from that operation to be part of a thing called the Illusionary Warfare Project, which was based at Nags Head in South Carolina. And we know this because of 2 reasons. One is Richard Nagel, who was the man who was giving him the money, said so later and reported it. And he had also been seen there in the Illusionary Warfare training base at Nags Head by a fellow by the name of Tosh Plumley, who was a CIA-trained pilot. And that I knew Victor Marchetti. Victor Marchetti was a longtime CIA operations specialist and intelligence officer, and he explained in some detail to me what the Illusionary Warfare Project was, and it was this whole operation where they were creating what they called dangles, intelligence dangles, where they would have young, usually low-level military people who might have access to some intelligence information. They would train them to give people the public impression that they were sympathetic to leftist causes, hoping that they would be contacted and recruited by Soviet agents, and then they could infiltrate them. And we know that it's just not going to happen that somebody like Oswald is just going to write a letter to the Marine Corps saying, I'd like to be let out of the Marine Corps because my mother had a can of peas fall on her nose and she needs to have me home. That isn't how it happens. And yet he just wrote that one simple letter to the Marine Corps Command and was immediately released from the Marine Corps. to go home to, quote, take care of his mother, and he was only home for 3 days before he was on a plane on the way to Russia. Okay, and that we also know that it doesn't happen that you go into Russia, you go into the embassy in Moscow, and you renounce your American citizenship, and 18 months later you get tired of it and decide you want to come back home, and they immediately say, well, that's okay, you can go right back home, and we'll give you the money to fly or to take the boat, and that's what he did. Okay, and also it just doesn't happen, and in fact it didn't happen, that he would just coincidentally be met when he arrives at Hoboken, New Jersey at the port of entry by a fellow by the name of Spaz Rakin, who in fact was the secretary of an aggressively anti-communist, extreme right-wing, pro-Nazi organization that was directly related to the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, who was the director of whom was Yaroslav Stetsko. And Yaroslav Stetsko, the boss of this guy, Spaz Rakin, was the head of the largest and most important umbrella organization of former Nazi collaborators in the entire world. And this guy was his assistant. And this guy, Stetsko, was an official reporter, full-time reporter to the Foreign Intelligence Digest. Okay? And the Foreign Intelligence Digest was set up by Charles Willoughby, that I told you about, that was the G2 to MacArthur. And it was done in Dallas in 1951. And that H.L. Hunt was one of the co-funders of this, as was William D. Pauley. Okay? And that and it turns out, through some investigation that I did, when you're looking for the Foreign Intelligence Digest, former issues of the Foreign Intelligence Digest, it turns out that they're kept at the University of Arkansas in box number 94 of the documents of Reverend Billy James Hargis, who was the extreme right-wing fascist minister in Dallas, who was very close to Edwin Walker, General Edwin Walker, the right-wing fascist military guy who was dismissed from the United States Army by President Kennedy because of his refusal to stop distributing John Birch Society materials to all of the people under his command. And it turns out that the John Birch of the John Birch Society, that John Birch was an intelligence officer who was assigned by General James Doolittle to be an intelligence officer for the Flying Tigers, which was founded by William Pauley, who was the same guy who was the co-founder and co-funder of the Foreign Intelligence Digest with Charles Willoughby and H.L. Hunt. You know, that kind of stuff doesn't just happen in the world. Okay? And it turns out that this Spaz Rakin, when he put Oswald and Marina on the airplane and flew them into Dallas, he was handed off directly to George de Mohrenschildt. George de Mohrenschildt is another right-wing fascist sympathizer who was part of the white Russian community in Dallas that come from Western Russia that were sympathetic to the Nazis when they invaded Russia, and they're pro-Tsarist royalists. And he's the one that took charge of him and shepherded Oswald all around Dallas. This is not something that is done for a person who is a devout leftist, as they were insisting that Oswald was. And we also have done further investigation and know that Oswald was intimately involved with Guy Bannister in New Orleans and David Ferry. And Guy Bannister was the head of the anti-communist, the World Anti-Communist League. in the southern United States, in Latin America. And the World Anti-Communist League is a fascist organization. There's a book that you might want to read, depending on what you're going to be doing your thesis on here. And that is a book called Inside the League. And it was written by the two brothers that were brothers of, not Drew Pearson, but one of the other major, you'll find it's called Inside the League. And it goes into detail about this being a fascist organization around the world. Not just a conservative group, or not just an anti-communist group, but an affirmatively fascist organization. And that in Guy Bannister, whom Oswald worked directly with, was the head of this thing. And in fact, Oswald was identified by the secretary of Guy Bannister as having been directly involved in helping to offload a bunch of weapons that were actually stolen from a particular arsenal in New Orleans, and that they were bringing those weapons to the base at Lake Pontchartrain, which was the anti-Castro Cuban exile, one of the 5 paramilitary bases in southeastern United States, where the S-Force people were, divided among those. And so that, and there is this really interesting letter that prior to this time, no one had been able to quite figure out what the heck it meant. There was a letter that was written by Lee Harvey Oswald to H.L. Hunt, asking Hunt to please clarify for Oswald what Oswald's employment relationship was with H.L. Hunt. And that had never made any sense to anybody, what that thing was all about. But it makes perfect sense when you understand that Lee Harvey Oswald was in fact working for the Foreign Intelligence Digest. And that all of the kind of things that he was doing, of going to ACLU meetings and going to meetings of the Fair Play for, or organizing the Fair Play for Cuba organization, that these were all activities that he was engaged in as an operative for the Foreign Intelligence Digest, of attempting to gather information against people that were viewed by the ultra-right wing as subversives. Okay, so that, and plus, there's absolutely no reason why Richard Billings, who was the Miami bureau chief for Life magazine, would make up a story telling me that he was present when William D. Pauley told John Martino, right standing next to Rip Robertson, that in fact they were going to kill the president. I mean, there's absolutely no reason why he would have ever told anybody that, because it's humiliating to him that he actually was there and heard them say that, and then later realized as soon as the president was killed that these are the people that probably killed him, and that he still hadn't done anything about it. And so he ends up telling me about this only years later, and there's no rational reason why he would do that, because it's contrary to his interests, because it was terribly embarrassing for him. And there's no way that Lee Harvey Oswald, no way that Lee Harvey Oswald was going to be able to fire, and this is a very simple fact. There's no possible way that Lee Harvey Oswald, from the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository, fired 3 shots with a bolt-action Mannlicher Carcano rifle in 6.5 seconds and had 3 hits on one in the back of President Kennedy, one of them that hit a second one, and clearly a second shot that hit John Connally, and a third shot that was the kill shot that killed President Kennedy. There's no possible way that the only way that anybody came close to replicating firing 3 shots from a Mannlicher Carcano rifle was, I told you, by bolting it down and cranking off 3 shots that they fired as fast as they possibly could, which still didn't make it in 6.5 seconds, and they weren't able to aim the rifle at all in order to get those shots off. So there's no way that happened. And ancillarily to that point is there's absolutely no way to support the proposition that Governor Connally was shot by the same bullet that hit President Kennedy, because there are, in fact, 3 separate frames of the Zapruder film. And I happen to know that because Richard Billings is one of the very few people in the world that ever had direct access to the Zapruder film, the original film, because he and his team are the ones that got the film. And they're the ones that got access to the developed frames, and he's the one that took the frames, the blow-up frames, the big, like 6 by 8 frames of the Zapruder film, and showed them to Governor Connally. And Governor Connally looked at them and said, see, look, I told you, I was not hit by the same bullet. Because as I told you the other day, look, here I am holding my Stetson, and there's President Kennedy in the back seat grabbing his throat, having already been shot through the throat. And I'm now turning around trying to look into the back seat, and I'm still holding my white Stetson in my right hand. And I turned all the way back to halfway to my left before I was hit. So it's perfectly clear that that was not the same bullet, he said. And he said, I know positively that it wasn't the same bullet. And so that means that there had to have been 3 separate shots. The one that hit the president in the back, there's actually a 4th shot that hit him in the throat, but then the shot that hit Connally, and then the kill shot that killed the president. And so there's no possible way that could have been fired from just one single Mannlicher bolt action rifle, that nobody could do that. Okay, and now a very important fact, one that you have probably almost certainly never heard about at all, is that it didn't just happen that Lee Harvey Oswald, on the night that the night after he'd been arrested, he was arrested on the afternoon of November 22nd. On the evening of November 23rd, at 11 p.m., he asked to have a telephone call made for him from the jail, from the Dallas jail. Does this make it work? Yeah, I think it does. Okay, you see this? This is a collect call request from the jail of the Dallas Police Department, requested by prisoner Lee Harvey Oswald, asking the operator to place a call to Raleigh, North Carolina, to a John Hurt, who is at area code 919-833-1253. And it turns out he's asked her to place the call for him. She reported it to the Secret Service. The Secret Service then said they wanted to monitor any such call if it were made. And the woman, L. Sweeney, her name is, who signed this particular verification that the call had been asked for, that she in fact rumpled up the request for the message and threw it into the wastebasket. And her assistant, let me see, here's her name. Her assistant, let me find here what her name is, just so you'll have it. I guess I didn't write it down here. But anyway, her assistant was sitting here, and she was shocked that this lady Sweeney had not placed the phone call that had been requested. And so when Sweeney went off to go a coffee break, this woman took the note out of the trash basket and kept it, just as a souvenir. Okay, and so that this is, and the fact is that John Hurt, at that number right there, turns out to have been a military intelligence officer. And upon further investigation, it turns out that he was an intelligence officer based at Nags Head, North Carolina, right where the illusionary warfare training base was. So that things like this don't just happen. It isn't just coincidental that Oswald tried to make this call, because he was trying to make a call to someone who was going to be his intelligence contact, so that he could get out of the problem that he was in. And number 9, there is no way that Jack Ruby, who was the Dallas bagman for Sam Giancana, who was instrumental in setting up the S-Force, that Santos Trafficante has confirmed to us were the ones that actually shot the president and killed him. There's no way that, that Sam Giancana's bagman in Dallas just gets upset over the fact that he felt bad for Jackie Kennedy and just happened to go inside the Dallas Police Department and gun down the alleged assassin of President Kennedy right in front of everybody. You know, that he just got a bad feeling for poor Mrs. Kennedy and decided he was going to go in and kill him. And he just happened to be the bagman for Sam Giancana. Okay? And moreover, number 10, there's no way that the kind of steps could have been taken that were verified to have been taken, attempting to fake certain evidence against Lee Harvey Oswald, unless there was some kind of a sophisticated plan underway to try to frame him up as being the one that killed the president. And there are a number of these things. For example, a fellow by the name of what's his name? He's got this really strange name. His name is Layton Martens, Layton. Martens, M-A-R-T-E-N, Layton Martens, a fellow that looks very much like Lee Harvey Oswald, actually appeared at a number of rifle ranges in the Dallas, Texas area, signing in under the name of Lee Harvey Oswald, and actually doing things like being very rowdy and walking in front of people who were trying to fire downrange and interfering with them, and actually shooting at other people's targets, and then introducing himself to them as Lee Harvey Oswald. There's a very peculiar thing about this, because one of my investigators, William John Stone Taylor, United States Marine Corps CID, Criminal Investigations Officer. I take that back. He wasn't an officer. He'd be insulted. He was just a sergeant in the Marine Corps. He was actually assigned shortly after the assassination to move in next door to Layton Martens' brother and to befriend him and try to get introduced to Layton Martens. Now, this came from the Marine Corps command structure, instructing him as a criminal investigator to befriend Layton Martens' brother to get to meet Layton Martens, to do surveillance on Layton Martens. He could never understand why that was done until we discovered that Layton Martens was one of the guys who was involved with Lee Harvey Oswald in unloading these stolen weapons in New Orleans that were being stored in Guy Bannister's office and then being brought to Lake Pontchartrain. And so that this fellow Layton Martens is also the guy who was roommates with David Ferry in New Orleans. And David Ferry was the Civil Air Patrol boss of Lee Harvey Oswald in the Civil Air Patrol. And yet Layton Martens is going around pretending he's Lee Harvey Oswald, firing a Mannlicher Carcano rifle at these rifle ranges, this old, weird, foreign bolt-action military weapon that was actually called the humanitarian weapon because it couldn't kill anybody. It was so inaccurate. And it was issued by the Italian military. And also, there was a completely fake report of Lee Harvey Oswald having gone to the Russian embassy in Mexico City and trying to get a visa to go to Cuba. And in fact, the Mexico CIA station was insisting that this was true, that it had been done shortly before the assassination. And it turns out that on further investigation, when in fact the video footage, the camera footage for the U.S. Embassy actually got a photograph of the person who had come in to apply as Lee Harvey Oswald for the visa, it was absolutely clear that it was not Lee Harvey Oswald. I mean, it isn't even close. He was short and squat and bald-headed and big muscular dude, and it was not Oswald at all. And everybody, once the photograph was shown to them, acknowledged that it wasn't he, and yet the Mexico station of the CIA was insisting that Lee Harvey Oswald had gone in and applied for a visa to go to Cuba. And then there was a fake telephone call that was placed, allegedly by Lee Harvey Oswald, to the Mexican embassy, or an embassy in Mexico. Again, and they ended up doing a voice print on it. And the person said they were Lee Harvey Oswald, and they were inquiring about how to get a visa to go to Cuba. And a voice print test was done on it, and it was positively proved that it was false, and it wasn't he. And so what is happening here? You know, why is it that people are, this Leighton Martens is showing up at these rifle ranges pretending to be Lee Harvey Oswald, firing a Mannlicher Carcano rifle? And why is it that people are falsely pretending that they're Lee Harvey Oswald, going to the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City to try to get a visa to Cuba? There's, in addition to that, these are just some of the big ones, is there's no way in the world that Richard Nagel, a member of the Field Operations Intelligence that was created by Charles Willoughby immediately after they created the Foreign Intelligence Digest out of Dallas. They organized a separate organization called the Field Operations Intelligence, of which Nagel was a part. There was no way that he, in September of 1963, this is 2 months before the assassination at the end of November, that he appears in a bank in El Paso and fires 2 shots into the ceiling of the bank, and then sits in his car waiting for the police to come and arrest him, and then tells them that they should look in the trunk of his car so that they can find these false IDs, photograph IDs of Lee Harvey Oswald under the name of A. Hidell. And in fact find fake IDs with Nagel's photograph on them in the name of Lee Harvey Oswald, and fake ID of Nagel, photo ID in the name of A. Hidell, right? And this is 2 months prior to the assassination. And when he's taken into custody by the police, he says to them, which is official record of the El Paso Police Department, saying, "I'd rather be here, arrested here and in jail, than in Dallas in November." Okay? So what I'm saying, there's just no way that can happen if there isn't some major sophisticated plan underway to attempt to direct evidence toward Lee Harvey Oswald as allegedly being the purchaser of the Carcano rifle that had been purchased through the mail by an A. Hidell. And there's also no reason for George de Mohrenschildt, who had been, as I mentioned to you, the white Russian fascist guy who was basically shepherding Oswald all around in Dallas, There was no reason for him, when he was approached, his daughter's house where he was visiting was approached by Gaetan Fonzie, one of the investigators for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. There was no reason why George de Mohrenschildt should have gone out into the garage and put a shotgun in his mouth and blown his brains out to avoid being questioned by the people from the House Select Committee on Assassinations, if in fact his relationship with Oswald was completely innocent. And there also would be no way that George de Mohrenschildt would have just innocently taken Lee Harvey Oswald to Collins Radio to try to get him a job at the Collins Radio Corporation, which in fact was the lessee of the Rex. In the first week of November, that was attempting to put anti-Castro Cuban exiles ashore in Cuba. In that the Rex is the same ship, CIA ship, proven that the CIA paid the dock fees for the USS Rex, okay? And that was seen by Richard Billings refueling the Flying Tiger on the night of June 19th of 1963, 5 months earlier, off Cuba. Okay, so there's no reason why any of these things would have happened, nor would there have been any reason for George de Mohrenschildt to write a letter to George H.W. Bush imploring Bush to intervene to keep de Mohrenschildt from being interrogated by the members of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, if in fact his relationship had been innocent. And there's no way that Lyndon Baines Johnson just happened to appoint Allen Dulles to be on the Warren Commission to investigate the killing of the president, in light of the fact that Dulles had been fired by John Kennedy in the fall of 1961 following the Cuban the debacle at the Bay of Pigs. There's no reason that he would have appointed him to be an objective investigator of the death of him, nor can I get a glass of water? I forgot to bring any water here. That there's no way that Lyndon Johnson would have just coincidentally attempted to persuade Earl Warren to become the head of the commission that became known as the Warren Commission, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, telling him that I absolutely need to have you be the head of this commission because it's essential that someone be there that can conceal the fact that there was an assassination team that had been organized to assassinate Fidel Castro, and that it was created by Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy, which is completely false because we know the details of it having been created by Richard Nixon back in June and July of 1960. There's no way that Lyndon Johnson could have even known about such an assassination team. Okay? And to specifically ask Earl Warren to take over as the head of that commission and specifically conceal the existence of this assassination team under the fabrication that it would have been discovered that it was the Kennedy brothers that created it. And if it were discovered that such an assassination team had been fielded by the Kennedys to kill Fidel Castro, that people would assume that Fidel Castro had found out about this and that therefore he had assassinated President Kennedy first, and therefore the United States would have to militarily invade the island of Cuba and Russia would go to war with us in a World War III. Now, there's no way that Lyndon Johnson just makes up a story like that, okay? Unless there is some much more sophisticated plan afoot. And what it appears to me to be is that clearly Lee Harvey Oswald was a part of this group. He was a part of that community. of those right-wing fascist elements that included H.L. Hunt and George Mohrenschildt and William Pauley and H.L. Hunt and what's his head, the Willoughby. That whole crowd that were fascists, and Bill Harvey, who had been the SIS, the Special Intelligence Services for the FBI down in the Mexico City station down there. And it turns out that there was a woman in Mexico City that the Mexico City CIA station tried to coerce into saying that she had met Lee Harvey Oswald, thank you, when he was down in Mexico City trying to get a visa to go to Cuba. And in fact, she was tortured to try to get her to say that, and she was tortured by Nasser Haro, the head of the DFS, whom I told you was the man who brought Joseph Burkholder Smith down to Argentina and brought him to the little town of Salta and brought him into the meeting where the Nazis were sitting at the table under a swastika flag, you know, and that's Nasser Haro. And Nasser Haro is the guy that tortured this woman to try to get her to falsely testify that Oswald had been in Mexico City and was her lover and was trying to get a visa to go to Cuba. All of which is factly false. Okay? So that what it appears is that while Lee Harvey Oswald was involved with all of those people, that in fact he was being set up. He was being set up to take the fall for this. But I've gotten in trouble with a number of the researchers in this area when I say that I think that there's reason to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald realized that there was going to be some kind of a false attack against Kennedy, that there was going to be a false assassination attempt against him, and that they were going to try to blame it on Fidel Castro in Cuba, and that he was sympathetic to such an endeavor, and that these kind of endeavors go on all the time in that particular milieu of those people, and that he may well have been knowledgeable that there was going to be a staged assassination, a mock assassination attack against him that could be used to instigate an attack against the island of Cuba, and that he found himself in the midst of it. And when, much to his surprise, that Kennedy was actually assassinated by this very group that he was part of, and he discovered that he was being set up for this, and that he fled the scene, and he went back to his house, and he got his .38 revolver, and he went to go meet someone, and he went to the school, to the Texas theater where I've been, and he went into the theater and he sat down in a particular seat, which is 3 rows from the back, as I recall, and 3 chairs in, which is a classic covert intelligence code. You go to the theater, you tell them they're going to meet them there, and you go 3 seats from the back and 3 seats in from the aisle, and that's where you're going to be sitting in case the people don't know what you look like. And then he went to the theater, and when he ends up getting busted, he realized that he had been set up. And that's why he attempted to make the telephone call to John Hurt to try to get through to the people that he had been involved with in the illusionary warfare group to vouch for him. Okay? And so that this is what it appears to be. And now there's no way, now let's shift to a handful of facts that all point toward who it was that really did this. That number one, assuming, as I do, that Trafficante was telling us the truth, that he had certainly no good reason to make up, that the S-Force that no one even knew about, which he admitted to us he helped put together, were the ones that actually assassinated the president in Dealey Plaza, that there's no way that the S-Force would have taken it upon themselves to kill the president and think they could possibly have gotten away with it. There were just too many people that knew who they were, you know? And they would have to have been authorized by at least their liaison officers from the CIA, which would have been E. Howard Hunt for the group that was in the Everglades, and Frank Sturgis that was in charge of the group out at No Name Key. Both of whom, you remember, had sided with the Cuban exiles in defying President Kennedy by launching attacks against the island of Cuba after they'd been explicitly prohibited from doing so following the Cuban Missile Crisis. Frank Sturgis on December 3rd launched the attack and sank a ship that was a Russian ship that was in the harbor in Havana in complete defiance of the president. And E. Howard Hunt was planning a second such operation in defiance of the president out of the Everglades, the base in the Everglades. So these two guys were sympathetic toward the Cuban exile group, and they would have been the people that would have had to have approved what the S-Force did before they ever would have dared to do it. Yet it's not reasonable at all that E. Howard Hunt would have, if he had done that, if he had been involved in that operation, that he wouldn't have blown the whistle on them when he got arrested. Not just because he got arrested at the Watergate Hotel, which we'll go into on Tuesday, but his just having been arrested for being in the Watergate Hotel, he could, if he was going to get, a year at some, resort, federal resort, where he had to be under house arrest or something for a year for having done that, would not have motivated him to blow the whistle on them about this. But the fact is that he concluded that they murdered his wife. That his wife was the one who was going to be carrying the money to Hunt to pay all the lawyers for the people that were involved in the Watergate burglary. And she was on an airplane that crashed and killed her. And E. Howard Hunt, and we know this from Trafficante, that E. Howard Hunt became convinced that they had killed her, as sending a message to him and the other burglars that they'd better be quiet. And yet, I'll give you a little bit of a heads up on this, is that you remember it was Hunt that was the one insisting, after they were arrested in the Watergate Hotel, which we'll go into on Tuesday, is that he was the one that was insisting that Nixon authorized the payment of the lawyers that were going to be representing all of the burglars. And that was that famous comment that Nixon asked Bob Haldeman. He said, well, how much do you think it would cost? And Haldeman said it would probably cost more than $1 million. And Richard Nixon says, oh, $1 million, we could get that. We could get that. But then he remembered that he was being recorded, and he said, but of course that would be wrong, he said. But that was E. Howard Hunt that they were talking about. And one of the things that Nixon said in that conversation is, we'd better be careful of this guy, because if he were to tear off that scab, there'd be an awful lot of pus or something that would come out from this. And that this is what they were talking about on the tapes that ended up becoming the smoking gun tapes that got Nixon virtually impeached. They returned the articles of impeachment out of the House Judiciary Committee. It was clear that the full majority of the House of Representatives were going to vote for the articles of impeachment, and he would have been impeached. And he didn't want to undergo any kind of a trial about that, because underneath all of this was the fact that Nixon had ordered them to break into the Watergate Hotel to try to wiretap Larry O'Brien to find out whether Larry O'Brien knew that it was Nixon that had put together the assassination team that killed the president. And so that you're going to be now made privy in this class to what it is that was underlying all of these huge scandals that took place just before you guys were born. That there were a whole series of these scandals, and it turns out they all circulated around the same thing, and that was the assassination of President Kennedy. And you'll see how that happened when we start discussing it on Tuesday. But there's also the fact that that there's no way that E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis would have green-lighted this operation against the president unless they had been authorized to do it by their superiors. And their superiors would have included Bill Harvey in the Miami station, Theodore Shackley, who was the head of the Miami station, and Allen Dulles, even though Allen Dulles was at that time no longer the director of the Central Intelligence Agency since October of 1961. But the fact is, there's evidence, direct proof, that Bill Harvey and the other people, including Shackley, that were in the Miami station of the CIA, were constantly going and seeing Allen Dulles, even though Dulles had been dismissed as being the director of the CIA. And they were coordinating what they were doing with Dulles, which is because Dulles had been made the head of the CIA because of his position as the consigliere of the people at Brown Brothers Harriman and at Sullivan and Cromwell. And that is why they were still going to him and taking directions from him. And that's why they would have had to have gotten Allen Dulles to sign off on this before they ever would have done that. And the fact is that there's no way that Allen Dulles would have had to have undertaken this on his own because of the powerful relationship that he had to these particular group of men. That were the private investment clients of Brown Brothers Harriman that were very close to George Herbert Walker and to Prescott Bush. That there was no way that Allen Dulles would have had to have gone all by himself to authorize the assassination of the President of the United States unless he could get the super secret okay from these guys. And remember, these are the people that he referred to, or let's be more specifically accurate, these are the people to whom James Jesus Angleton was referring when he told Joe Trento, the author of Prelude to Terror and a fellow author for Counterpoint Press that publishes my books, that Joe Trento said that when he talked to James Jesus Angleton, Angleton told him that Allen Dulles in 1953 had hired James Jesus Angleton to be the head of counterintelligence for the Central Intelligence Agency on the explicit condition that Angleton agree never to flutter, that means give a lie detector test to, either Dulles himself or any of the 60 men that worked with him to help fund Germany at the end of World War I up into World War II. And that was the specific demand that was made by Dulles to Angleton. And so this is the group of people that Dulles, it isn't that he answered to these people, but these were the people that were deep into the centers of power, financial banking, investment banking, running the major corporations, the steel corporations, the petroleum industry. These 60 men were the people that Roosevelt was talking about earlier in some of those quotes, where he said that, you know, if this process of corporate consolidation continues, by the time we reach the end of this century, the entire country will be run by less than 50 men who own and run the major corporations. And that's what he said back in 1942. Okay, and these are the people that is not that Dulles answers to, but that he works in conjunction with in making these major policy decisions. So there was no reason why Dulles would have had to have gone out on the limb by himself to jeopardize himself by not having the support of these people. Because as you remember, that what they were saying, because it was true, is that Kennedy had not only abandoned any effort to overthrow the Cuban revolutionary government, but he had in fact agreed to open a back channel of communications to normalize relations with Fidel Castro. He had in fact reached out to Nikita Khrushchev, and by reason of these exchange of letters through Norman Cousins, these 18 separate private letters, that they were planning to disassemble the nuclear warheads of the United States arsenal and those of the Soviet Union. And that these 60 men in Dulles and their compadres had spent 100 years basically putting into place by 1963, between 1868 and 1963, they spent almost 100 years, they and their grandfathers, had spent this time building the United States into the major hegemonic force on the planet. And that it was by dint of their control of a massively superior amount of nuclear weapons that they had the power not only over the Soviet Union, but China, who they could not possibly confront in a traditional military engagement on the field, because the Chinese could put in the field a million men against them, you know. And so that this Allen Dulles would very much have wanted to get the green light for what it is that he wanted to do. And he was in the catbird seat of being able to tell these men that the deepest, darkest secret was that they had found out that Kennedy was engaged in the exchange of these letters with Khrushchev and was actually planning to disassemble the nuclear arsenal of the United States. And this is viewed as high treason by these people. And you remember, I told you that John Kennedy asked John Frankenheimer to produce and direct the movie 7 Days in May, which actually sets forth the exact scenario of the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force in the Joint Chiefs of Staff gathering and organizing a coup against the President of the United States because of the President of the United States wanting to enter into a treaty with Russia to disassemble the nuclear weapons of both countries. And that's exactly what the movie was saying. And that Kennedy himself, and I know this from Pierre Salinger, as I mentioned, told me directly that Kennedy had asked Pierre Salinger at a particular White House dinner to go over to John Frankenheimer, who was at the dinner, and tell him that the president wanted him to make this movie. Okay? So that this is what was going on at the time. And remember that President Kennedy was doing this whole thing in coordination with Pope John the 23rd. That Pope John the 23rd was in communications with Khrushchev and with Kennedy in offering to be the broker of this agreement, which otherwise there would have been no defensible reason to believe that it could have been enforced effectively. And yet, if there was a person that was trusted deeply by Khrushchev and by Kennedy, that this could be done. And that was exactly what was underway in 1963. And so Pope John the 23rd then penned a specific papal encyclical called Pacem in Terris, in which he explicitly called for the elimination of the nuclear weapons, and used language that was virtually identical to the language that Kennedy and Khrushchev were using in the exchange of their letters, showing that he had access to those letters and knew what was going on and was serving as the broker of that. And it's important to remember that Dulles would have been the guy, if he got the nod from these 60 men that were in this cabal, that would have then reached out through Theodore Shackley, who was the Miami bureau chief of the CIA and the previous 20-year-plus deputy to Reinhard Gehlen, the head of the Nazi anti-Soviet and anti-Eastern Bloc intelligence, who was now serving as the chief of intelligence for West Germany, that it was through Shackley that they would have gotten back to that fascist cabal down in South America, to have them realize that they were getting ready to kill the president, to protect this fascist alliance around the world. And that's how this would have gone. And there's no way that Edward Lansdale would have been in Dealey Plaza unless the people that were involved in the Anderson Trust were involved in this. Because remember, Ed Lansdale is the one that initiated the process that resulted in the creation of the Anderson Trust, this $1.2 trillion in secret gold certificates that were being used to finance the creation and maintenance of this fascist network throughout the world. And just parenthetically, when I don't think if I mentioned to you that when Santo Romano died, the guy that Edward Lansdale actually had doing the torturing of the driver of General Yakushima, the head of the Golden Lily company, the Japanese military group that had commandeered all these things. When Santo Romano died, he left in his will to Edward Lansdale $50 billion to Edward Lansdale. So this operation of the Anderson Trust was extraordinarily powerful, and therefore the people that were involved in the Anderson Trust, which would have been Robert Lovett and John J. McCloy and Robert Anderson, would also have had to have been involved in giving the green light to this, which would have been easy since Lovett and Anderson were also senior partners in Brown Brothers Harriman. Okay, so this is basically setting forth for you in simple terms what the sort of the key facts are that are in my judgment virtually beyond dispute, since I happen to have personal knowledge of several of these key facts, specifically revolving around not only what William Pauley said in the presence of Dick Billings, but also from my own direct personal conversations with William Buckholder, Joseph Burkholder Smith, telling me about this extraordinary experience that he had in the Mexico station of the CIA, being brought by Nasser Haro with the full consent of Tom Polgar to sit down with these fascist Nazis as a condition for him being able to stay on as the deputy CIA station chief down there. And so this is what I'm telling you about, so that you'll know that this is true. And the key thing to understand is that I'm telling you this only so that you'll know how bad things are not so that it will paralyze you, but so you will be able to know what it is that you have to do something about. Because it doesn't do it. There's this famous quote. I'll tell you about it in context next week. But when I was getting ready to file the complaint in the Iran-Contra case, and I brought a copy of the complaint over to Scott. What was Scott's name? Scott, the guy at the National Security Archives. Scott something, or I'll think of his name. But the bottom line is I went over and sat down with him to bring a copy of this over to him. And he looked at it and he said, oh, this can't be true. This can't be true, or else I would know about this. And I said, well, it is true and you don't know about it. So I think you should check your sources and come to a determination whether you think this is true or not. And so he said he was going to do that. A couple of days later, he called me and he asked me to come back over to the National Security Archives. And I sat down and he said, literally said, well, I'll be a son of a bitch. He said, it turns out this is true. He said, I checked with my sources and it's true that these guys are doing this thing. They've set up this whole enterprise to act in complete disregard of what presidents happen to disagree with them about. And so what he said is, look, I'm going to go over to talk to Peter Rodino, who's still the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. And Peter Rodino had been the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee when they returned the articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon and voted to send those articles to the floor of the House of Representatives to be voted on. And why can't I think of Scott's last name? What is Scott's last name? The fellow over at the National Security Archives. Anyway, I'll think of it in a minute. But the bottom line is that that Scott was the guy. He was what he said to me. He said, "Oh, look," he said, "I'm going to go see Peter Rodino. You know, Peter Rodino loves me because Scott was the guy who actually interviewed Alexander Butterfield, who was the guy who revealed the fact that Nixon had the electronic recording device set up in the Oval Office." And so when they found out about that, then they were able to subpoena those tapes. And by subpoenaing those tapes, they could actually find out what the actual conversations were that Richard Nixon was having in the Oval Office, trying to obstruct the investigation of the Watergate burglary. And when Scott went over to meet with Peter Rodino, I was waiting to hear from him, and I figured it would just take a day or two. I hadn't heard from him for 2 or 3 days, and so I called over to the National Security Archives, and I talked to Tom, who was his assistant, and I said to Tom, I said, "What's the story? I've been waiting for Scott to call me back," and he said, "Oh, look, you got to come over and talk with me right away." So I went over and sat down with Tom. Tom said, "Oh, Scott is so embarrassed. He went over to talk to Peter Rodino about this, and he showed him a copy of your complaint." And Peter Rodino looked at this, and he said, "My God, Scott," he said, "this is terrible." He said, "If what's being said here in this complaint is true, why, I mean, I've been telling my constituents that if they didn't like the way that American foreign policy was going, that they ought to write a letter to their congressman. And if your congressman doesn't do anything about this, you ought to vote for somebody else to be your congressman." He said, "But if what these people are saying is true, why then we haven't even been in charge." He said, "I'm not going to allow the United States Congress to investigate anything like that." That's what he said. So what I'm suggesting to you is that, if you don't understand this information, you may still be living in the illusion that all you have to do is write a letter to your congressperson, or that in fact you might even be able to replace your congressperson and that things would get solved. But that's clearly not true, because they are not in charge. That this cabal is in charge. And so the key is having to figure out how to dig in and find out who these people are, what their leverages of power are, and how we can dislodge them. And so that's the conversation that we're going to have here toward the end of the course, because I don't want you leaving this course thinking that you've just been told a lot of really bad news. Because this is in fact good news. The fact that you now know what's really going on is better news than you might have expected to get at college. And so at least with regard to this aspect of reality, which I think is a pretty critical central aspect of reality here, you now know what it is that we're up against. So we've got this peculiar thing going on with the election right now, where the people that are in charge of the Republican and Democratic Party together are really quite distressed right now, because it's hard to say whether it's on the right in a consistent way, but obviously the Republican Party is traumatized about the fact that this guy Trump has risen into the ascendancy and has taken advantage by having access to his own private fortune to be able to finance his election. He's actually been able to get, or is on the very brink of getting, a majority of the elected delegates to the Republican National Convention, and that he's on the very brink of now being the nominee. And so they're trying to figure out what it is they're going to do about that. And in the Democratic Party, it turns out that Bernie Sanders has been regularly beating Hillary Clinton in these recent primary races, and he has approximately 45% of all of the delegates. And he's involved in a very aggressive campaign to try to see whether or not he can secure enough of the delegates to keep Hillary Clinton from getting the 2,136 of them or so that she has to have in order to win on the first ballot. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to win a majority of the popularly elected delegates, so that he's going to corner her, that in order for her to get over on the first ballot, she's going to have to invoke the superdelegates, who are all the official party members, who are the Congress people and the senators and the governors, the lieutenant governors and attorneys general, that are all registered members of the Democratic Party. What the Democrats, the leadership of the Democratic Party are concerned about is that this would not look good. To have her not win a majority of the votes of the elected delegates, and have to rely upon the professional politicians who are all being paid by the exact same PACs and businesses and corporations that she's having her campaign financed by, in part. That's not to agree or disagree with that. That's just to make that observation, that that's what the condition is that's going on. And so that there are two candidates that are basically defying the normal constabulary of the Republican and Democratic parties here. And so that this is a moment in comparatively recent history, which would be all of your lives and all of my life, that the Republican constabulary and Democratic Party constabulary are not in the tightest control that they are usually in. They have, by attempting to pay homage in some sense to popular participatory democracy, they've let it get out of hand. That the fact is that the people engaged in popular democracy have displayed to the constabulary, the two parties, that they don't like them, and that they feel that they're being cheated by them, that the game is rigged against the regular people. And peculiarly, very peculiarly, one is an arrogant, blowhard billionaire who spent his own money basically admitting openly that he's manipulated the system and not paid taxes and basically bribed congressional people to do what it is he wanted to do. And now he wants to run as, for the presidency, publicly revealing how corrupt they are. You know? But on the other hand, there is Bernie Sanders, who is basically just plain throwing down on them and exposing them for what they are. And yet they believe that they've cornered Bernie Sanders to have him now only be engaged in attempting to try to get 45% of all of the delegates at the convention to be seated on the Rules Committee and on the Platform Committee, so that he can try to get the Democratic Party to publicly endorse a platform that gives Hillary Clinton the space to take much more progressive policy positions than she might otherwise take. Now, as to how successful that's going to be, in light of the long-going historical attachment that Hillary Clinton has developed with these financiers and with her husband's foundation, which relies upon major grants from these same major financial institutions and corporations, is yet to be seen. But that's the dynamic that's going on now, and so there's a threat from Trump, which we may still yet see, even despite all of the public hugging that is starting to go on now on the part of the Republican constabulary, kind of warming up to and starting to hug Trump and get Trump to be a little more moderate and stop saying the kind of things he's going to say. You know, if the Democratic populists are successful in getting Hillary Clinton to, for example, choose Elizabeth Warren as her vice president, her vice presidential candidate, that will probably send Trump completely out of control. And that he'll become the lunatic that he generally is. And he's going to be making every kind of lurid, nasty comment that he can about the two of them, and therefore expose himself to the 53% of the American electorate that are women, even though we're now up at an 80% level of complete revulsion on the part of the women against him, including some suburban Republican women who can't stand him. So we're going to have to see how this plays itself out. But I don't want to get us too deeply into just discussing the present election. We're going to be able to do that a little bit more in week 10 when we kind of try to sum up where we are in the course. But I wanted to get this information out in front of you specifically about the Kennedy assassination in the context of this course, showing the lengths to which this cabal will go and the lengths to which the cabal has gone, in fact, not only in attempting to mount a military coup against Roosevelt in 1934, but actually assassinating a sitting president in order to maintain their unchallenged military superiority over everyone else in the world. So that's. I just wanted to take two of our regular sessions together to lay out the basic details of this. I've also we've put together one of these charts that I know you love so much. This is a chart of the actual assassination itself. Okay, the other one is the larger context in which this took place. This is the context of the actual assassination itself. So you can pick these up at the end of this. We've got about 10 more minutes left that we can begin the discussion here, because I want to continue the discussion when we go over next door for our hour or so together. But I want to direct some of our attention in that meeting over there to your thesis, that you're going to be writing here. And I want to start talking with you about some of the ideas that you have, and don't be bashful about sharing them, about what you think your topic might be, and that we can kind of work it out together here to help you. Okay? So let's try to focus the myriad questions you have on the particular assassination itself and the role that the cabal, I believe, played in this. Okay?
Do you have any idea why they chose Lee Harvey Oswald as their scapegoat for this whole thing?
Well, Lee Harvey, part of that would depend upon when they made the decision to do this, you see. And Lee Harvey Oswald had been a guy who had already been dipped, in this illusionary warfare thing. He had already been colored as a pro-communist and a leftist. So they had a guy right there. One of the key elements of this thing is that the initial objective may have been to get rid of him because he was secretly trying to disassemble the nuclear warheads of the American arsenal. The bottom line is they wanted to attack Cuba. They wanted to launch a military attack. And they wanted to basically instigate, some of them wanted to instigate a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union to be able to stomp them out. The thing that Curtis LeMay did, that they actually advocated a unilateral, secret sneak attack on the part of the United States against the Soviet Union to bomb them flat, while we still had such a remarkable advantage over them with the number of missiles that we had. So that as it was during that, it was after the Cuban Missile Crisis when he made this turnabout and started basically organizing this peaceful would-be world, that they would have made that decision. And that's at the end of 1962. And so that they already, when they started thinking in terms of killing him, they had to try to figure out some way not only to get him stopped from disassembling the missiles, they were trying to figure out some way to blame it on Cuba so they could then attack it. And so here was a guy who is coming back into the United States. He's in the hands of the right-wing cabal. He's actually working in New Orleans, helping them smuggle weapons around and do this kind of stuff. So they've got a patsy right there among themselves. And if they can basically coax him into participating in a false assassination attempt that they can then blame on Castro, he could be game for that. That he would be willing to be involved in something like that. But to get surprised by the fact that they actually assassinated him, in the midst of this fake assassination attempt, freaked him out. So that I would think that's the reason that they would have picked him, is because it gave them the additional dimension of being able to blame it on Cuba. And that's why they did these fake things of him going down to Mexico City and trying to get the visa to set him up to, why don't you try to pretend that you're part of the Fair Play for Cuba committee. That's showing that he's part of this effort to try to direct the suspicion toward them from this potential false assassination attempt. So that's why I think that they would have focused on him.
So I'm sure that you've heard of the Babushka lady, the woman that they haven't. Can you speak to that?
Well, there are about 6 or 8 different theories about this whole thing, and that's the one that was with they had the babushka, and then they had the umbrella person too. That's what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Yes, in that they've drilled down on that, and they have found that they've actually felt compelled to have to address some of these things. And they've tracked down who the umbrella person is and who the babushka woman is and all that. And they've basically eliminated those as part of the real conspiracy here. And that there's a couple others, like there's this whole assertion that the driver of the car turned around and shot him, but that's completely put the lie to by the individuated frames once you get at the actual Zapruder film. And so there are some other ones too. What are some of the though they had there's a whole major one about the Federal Reserve, the people that were in support of the Federal Reserve because they were asserting that on June 5th of 1963 he issued Executive Order 11111, ordering the printing of gold certificates and silver certificates, attempting to go off the Federal Reserve System. But we've drilled in on that, and it's clear that wasn't going to happen. That wasn't what it was really doing. So there are probably as many as 12 to 15 different kind of systematic explanations for what was going on here. But many of them are just little individual pieces, like the umbrella man. Oh, well, look, there was a guy. What's a guy doing carrying an umbrella on a sunny day like that? And why would he have raised the umbrella and lowered the umbrella just so close to when the shots rang out? Those are coming at it kind of from the bottom, logistically, and noticing little things wrong. But the advantage that we have over time of having reviewed all of this stuff, you can come in at a higher level and have a clear kind of deductive understanding of what it is that happened. And then you can look down into the details, and it explains all kinds of things that you can't really explain. But that one's been pretty well investigated, and it's not going anywhere. Have we got a few?
Where can we get more information on Kennedy's communication with Castro and Khrushchev?
There's a couple books. There's one book called what is it? Kennedy's World of Peace. I'll bring you the author on that. I think it's Kennedy's World of Peace. It's sitting on my desk now. But then there was another one called the Unlikely Triumvirate, I think, which I'll get the author of that one too. They were talking about this issue about John the 23rd and Khrushchev and he in the letters. But you can look up some of the Norman Cousins, under Norman Cousins, and find it, because he is the guy that was carrying a number of the letters back and forth. So you can pull him up under that, and also you can look under like the secret communications, because there's a group of sort of publicly known secret communications that the letters that were exchanged by Khrushchev, the big famous letters, where Bobby Kennedy said ignore the last letter and pretend you only got this one. There's a number of private communications that went through the State Department channels that have now been publicly revealed. But these other ones are not. They're just these esoteric. And Jim Douglas may talk about some of it too in the JFK and the Unspeakable, because he's a pretty active Catholic social justice person. So he probably knows some stuff too about of John the 23rd and his activities in that. Okay, but I'll get the names of those other couple authors in the books. Okay, great. Okay, so look, it's time now. Why don't we puddle over next door, and we've got another hour to work on this stuff, okay?